This is a really wild OTA that I think is going to really shake up the metagame. The main change that I think is going to be responsible for that is this change to Techno-Organic Virus, which is a little weird on first read. It's going to 2 cost, and then the entire bit of the text where it gains cost the more you play it is going away. Now, I think this is actually very clever. Techno-Organic Virus is a very good deck, and it's hard to figure out a way to nerf it that doesn't tie it more to Mobius. A lot of people, when they're asked how to nerf Techno-Organic Virus, come up with something that makes it more expensive the more you play it, and that actually just means that you play it with Mobius even more. So I think one of the big things that I didn't like about Techno-Organic Virus's presence in the metagame was how tied it was to Mobius and how much it supplemented these decks that are just like 5 or 6 tech cards, some Techno-Organic Virus fodder, and then Techno-Organic Virus. Those decks have a pretty deleterious effect on the metagame. It's fine if people play a tech card to beat a matchup. It's not fine when your entire game plan in every matchup is a billion tech cards. And I think that is a very reasonable reason to nerf something, but I couldn't come up with a version of Techno-Organic Virus that actually did something to decouple it from Mobius. And they have. Now what happens is you play it at 2, you get a copy at 2. Which instead of being a card that you play with Mobius, is now a card that you play with Quinjet and is countered by Mobius. And that's a really interesting change, because it takes this card into more of a build around me in multiple ways kind of card, and much less a put some stuff that has good stats that you want to remove the stats from, and then put a bunch of tech cards in here because I'll supplement the rest of this. That is a good direction for this card. To be clear, I also think this probably is a nerf just in like a lot of base use cases. Let's say you don't have your enabler, whether that be Mobius or Quinjet. You are going to be getting less output out of this. In order to play it twice, that's 4 energy instead of 3. And even if you had the Mobius, sometimes it was 2. And if you have the Quinjet, now it's going to be 3. This is a downgrade in most cases of play that you are playing it normally, I think. But it is still a fairly interesting card that has demonstrated an ability to really make decks be built around it, and I don't think that it's good to just obliterate those off the face of the map. The reason I like this change is because it is explicitly decoupling it from tech cards and introducing an actual weakness to a tech card in it, right? If you're a Quinjet deck, first of all, you got to play a 1/1 to make that work, and you don't want to remove the text of that, and so this deck that already wants to roll downhill is now stuck in the world where they're playing 1/1s, and that's not very good. The other questions you end up asking are like, do I want to overlap with Gambit Horseman? He's a 3/5 now. That's a really cool Iron Patriot follow-up. Am I doing that stuff now? But I like Gambit Horseman's text. Do I want to be a V-Hand deck? I like V-Hand's text. How do I make all of this work at the same time? I need extra energy. I need to cheat harder, right? Like that kind of thing is really interesting, because those decks are already very weak to Mobius. And so introducing more things into the deck that add output to it, but also increase the weaknesses of it, pretty interesting direction for both the Techno-Organic Virus decks and for the V-Hand decks. I think largely the big thing I like about this is that it's a nerf to Techno-Organic Virus that does not tie Techno-Organic Virus even further into a package of tech cards. That is, I think, a very good decision. Whether Askani getting this nerf might be a little bit controversial, because I think a lot of people, myself included, forecasted her getting a bigger nerf or were more concerned with her than the developers seem to be. But I am fairly sympathetic to the position that they're in. When I think about a card like Mother Askani, what the decks I want to be playing it are the decks that engage with it in a meaningful way, which is to say decks that care about copying stuff and decks that care about buff stuff. A lot of that is happening in the metagame right now, so her play rate is going to be super high, even if those decks are just around, right? So on that level, it's not necessarily fair to knock her for her play rate being as high as it is, but on the other hand, there are going to be decks that are just playing Mother Askani for the sake of playing Mother Askani, and they have nothing to do with buffing or copying cards. They're just like, this is awesome, and I'm going to do this. In fact, the original versions of the TOV deck still do that, and you can very easily swap out a Stardust for her, and she'll be totally fine, and there is absolutely nothing in that deck that actually synergizes with it. It's just a good enough card to actually do. And to my mind, that's the problematic use case of what Mother Askani is bringing to the table. It's not nearly that she's problematic in or it's not merely that she's problematic in the buff and copy decks, is that she's just kind of a good enough card to see play everywhere else, right? And this is like a buff season. There's an amount of leniency you can give to buff decks that are doing buff things that lean into like what we're doing in the season, right? But I don't think it's okay that this card is centralizing in the way that it is. And I also have a particular animus towards copiers because I think over the long term, copiers make more Marvel Snap games play out the same way and also intensify balance mistakes. So if a copier and another card are similarly powered, I would nerf the copier harder. So by that token, I think maybe it's possible they didn't go far enough on Mother Askani, but I also think it's probably the right decision for them not to go super far on Mother Askani the first time they actually try to deal with her. Martyr going down to 1-5, I think is one of those nerfs that's very easy to look at and say, this was a failed experiment, but I'm not actually sure how failed of an experiment it was. I tend to think that generally the goal of balance is to make the game more fun and more enjoyable and to provide cards that aren't necessarily going to have a lot of time in the sun with some time in the sun. I think it's very difficult for me to hear people complain about this being a bad decision to make Martyr a 1-6 and then also say that they wished they did more impactful buffs to cards nobody played, because I think it's very difficult to hold both of those positions simultaneously. And I think that generally when you do buff a card nobody plays, which Martyr got a bunch of buffs in a row effectively, she went to 1-6, TOV came out, Shadowlands Daredevil came out, Wilson Fisk came out. All of that was relevant to her, but it also all taught everybody how to play Martyr. And now there's a lot of a greater understanding among players that Martyr is a good card that meaningfully matters. If anything, I think that this is a buff to Lizard, weirdly, where Martyr going to 1-5, okay, now it's not locking in your Wilson Fisk the same way, and I think that that provides more texture to 2-drops, because choosing between a Lizard and an Iron Patriot is already a fairly interesting contextual decision. Martyr tended to make that decision not matter, because you'd be able to, since you had the Martyr on the board, follow up with the Wilson Fisk anyway, so you didn't have to make that choice. But now that you actually have to make that choice, there's a lot of interesting dynamics that come into those games, and Martyr not being at 6 is a big part of why you have to make that choice. So largely, I think that if TOV still survives, she ends up being a part of it. It's also possible that they over-nerfed TOV as a package and under-nerfed the card Wilson Fisk, who, if you really think about it, Wilson Fisk is the card that these decks are, I'm not gonna say like built around, but like, if TOV goes away, the deck that'll replace it as the interaction deck is Supergiant, and that deck's going to play Wilson Fisk, but that deck's not going to play Martyr, and it doesn't necessarily have to play Virus, right? The overlap between TOV and the Supergiant deck is like Lizard and Fisk and Iron Patriot, and none of that stuff got nerfed. Only the stuff specific to TOV. Zombie Sentry going to 2-1 is, I think, a pretty interesting change. This is effectively a 2-1 that can get up to a 2-5, depending on the status of your right location. And I also kind of like that it pushes the zombie deck a little bit closer to a bounce package. Not that I think it's going to necessarily get to a bounce package necessarily, but having a cheaper guy who rewards full locations, and the fact that bouncing your horde is as good as you would think it is, if you can then generate a second horde, it effectively means all of these cards have double the text that they normally would. That's a really cool interaction that has never gotten the ability to actually see daylight. And I think that, Gambit Horseman existing puts a pretty hard cap on how zombie decks are going to be able to be played in a meta context anyway. You're just going to have these built-in awkward and terrible matchups. But being able to double up your horde is something that I think in the abstract is a really cool thing to do. These decks got a big buff with Venus, which I think is a really cool addition to them. Maybe there's some kind of overlap between a Venus deck and a bouncy version of the horde list that hasn't been tried before. I don't think this is going to become meta, but I think it's a serious upgrade to a card that basically wasn't doing anything for its own archetype for a very long time. Now it might be able to sort of allow the archetype to branch a little bit, where typically the zombie archetype has been very one note, very straightforward. You're kind of only doing one thing in it, and now maybe there's some more opportunity to do some other stuff. I will say that this just being a really solid card in terms of just, if I'm going to play a zombie horde deck, 2 energy horde 4 that I'm then doubling up, or maybe I'm getting additional procs off Venus. The value prop does seem about right for this, where it didn't seem nearly as good for the 3-4 version. Now, I know that I've advised on this channel before to not do Krag, but when I look at new Kraglin, I think that this is like just probably a pretty good card. The real issue with Kraglin is that he's sort of a reverse copier, is how I think is a reasonable way to describe him, where one of the things that copiers do amazingly well is they intensify your synergy. You're a Victoria hand deck playing a bunch of created cards. Okay, well, I'm going to copy my Victoria hand. That intensifies my synergy drastically, right? You are a Captain Carter deck. I'm going to get a second Captain Carter. That intensifies my synergy drastically. Kraglin is always taking something away. And I think that, like, in another world, this guy would have been kind of beast mode if we were playing, like, Wiccan decks still. I could very easily just be like, I'm playing this guy in my Wiccan deck. He is just awesome. I don't care what he does. He's just amazing. I don't know that we're in that world, but in a world where fair Marvel Snap is like kind of a big part of what we're doing, I can totally see playing this. The thing is, even the fair Marvel Snap lists are like not necessarily all that fair anymore. Wiccan was kind of the last one. If you look at TOV, I mean, like, imagine you burn your TOV. It's the worst thing ever, but obviously you can't really think about this card like that. Largely, though, when I see this, I mean, like, split card 3/9 or 3/5, get +2 energy. If you just play a bunch of fairly replaceable cards, does this guy not seem like he's going to be pretty good to you? Like, this is a card that, like, I know we're not supposed to do Krag on this channel. I know the metagame might not necessarily fit him, but I am a lot more compelled by this guy than I previously was. Magus, a bit of a weirdo, going to 2/4. One of the really interesting things about Magus is that I think he's like a pretty good card in ongoing decks, but I think ongoing decks care too much about the density of their boards, right? When you look at what this card is copying in an ongoing deck, it's often something like a Captain Carter, a Captain America. These are decks that play Spectrum, right? And so you don't really want to spend that 3 energy copying that thing. Because you're a deck that if you're playing Captain Carter, if you're playing Captain America, you scale up having cards on the board. Captain Carter, Captain America, Spectrum, these all want ongoing cards on the board. So it's never ending up being a good idea to use Magus to copy something because it just prevents you from having a guy on the board, and you need guys on the board for your synergies to work. And I think that's sort of been the ultimate downfall of Magus in that context, is that, like, he's very limited in terms of what he can actually copy meaningfully. He can't copy on reveals, he can only copy ongoings, and he can't copy activates, because if he copies an activate, well, too bad, he already used his own activate. So he ends up just being an ongoing card, and he has these structural problems in ongoing too. I do think that at a 2/4, he's a lot more of a respectable ongoing card. You're a lot more willing to play him, but I worry that those structural problems will stand in his way almost regardless of what you put on him. These last two changes I largely dislike, which is rare for me, I think. I dislike this change to Lockheed because they just nerfed Techno-Organic Virus, which is the card I would have wanted to play with Lockheed. Lockheed is a card that scales off of playing 1 costs in other locations. I would have absolutely loved to spam TOV and Mobius and let me play my Lockheed at 2/2. Unfortunately, they nerfed TOV, and now it's a 2-cost card, and I don't want to do that. You're going to make me play Kitty Pryde with Lockheed, which, to be clear, I understand that's the lore-correct pairing, but Kitty Pryde is not a good card right now, and there are not a lot of Kitty Pryde decks that I feel excited about playing, and this 1 power to Lockheed is not going to make me feel excited about playing those Kitty Pryde decks. I don't know, man. I would have played this in TOV, and now I'm not going to play it in TOV, and I don't think I'm going to play it in Kitty Pryde decks. Like, I know I'm overstating this because Kitty Pryde is still a relatively popular card, but like in the Golden Gauntlet, she was like 40th or so in representation. She had like a 36% win rate, and it's like, that's kind of how I feel about her. It's just, I love her. She's my favorite card in the game. I would love to do this. I cannot, with a straight face, recommend someone play a Kitty Pryde deck. I can't do it. If their goal is even remotely related to winning, I don't think I can recommend it. And unfortunately, that's kind of even more where they've put Lockheed, because of what they did to TOV. It just is what it is. I think everyone's going to be mad at me for not liking this one. This is one of those ones that, like, a bunch of people ask for all the time. Let's make Crystal a 3/6. Let's make her a better card so I can actually play her. I don't like the effect Crystal has on games. I've talked about how copiers tend to homogenize Marvel Snap over time and tend to push both players. They tend to push you to the top of your range more and more often. The higher the density of them you have, the more likely it is you're going to do something largely towards the top of your range, because you're not running bad cards. You're just running cards that give you copies of your good cards. Crystal is a card that does this, but for both players. Both players get the additional draw, both players get pushed towards the top of their range, and as we're currently in Synergy Marvel Snap mode, I think this is just going to be the kind of thing that makes more games play out as players passing as ships in the night. I'm doing my thing, you're doing your thing, whose thing is bigger, who's going to win? And I think that it's not necessarily a bad design thing. I don't think this is going to make Crystal busted. I just think that, like, from a sort of perspective of game health, it's not the kind of card that I'd want to make people play. And Crystal's probably not going to be all that good. There's going to be decks that can play her that are all combo oriented, that are pretty fall aparty. Like you're probably going to see people trying her in Tribunal and various Onslaught decks, things like that. But those decks got nerfed, and maybe that's why they feel safe to put Crystal back up, or put Crystal up, because they're not as worried about the, someone's just going to gambit you every game. But I just don't like the way this pushes both players towards the top of their range and makes the games more about being at the top of your range. It just doesn't really seem like a healthy thing for a game to be introducing as a major part of what is going to be in the game. And to be clear, again, I don't think it's going to be busted. I don't want people saying like, oh, KM hates this because he thinks it's going to be too strong or whatever. I don't think it's going to be too strong. It's going to be fine. But it is just a dynamic that I would be a lot more comfortable if they didn't introduce. Last up, Adamantium Infusion. This is not an actual change. It's just updating the wording to reflect what is different about Adamantium Infusion versus other skills. Other skills banish after they are resolving. Adamantium Infusion banishes as part of its own resolution, so that you can play it in locations that have 3 things in it, because if it didn't banish as part of its own resolution, you would not be able to play it in a location that had 3 things in it and have it actually bring anything back. This has been how it's worked forever. This is just a text update. All right, y'all, let me know what you think. I kind of expect people to be mad at me for my Crystal take. We'll see how things go. Maybe I don't have as good a view of what my audience is as anyone else does. Who knows? But as always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.